If they continue to get away with declaring major cities war zones, will it stop the voting process? Okay, so I'm going to back up a little bit here. I just threw out Stephen Miller's name. I also threw out Kristi Noem's name. And I think there's something that so far I haven't seen in the questions that is important. And maybe it's because you're seeing it everywhere else and you don't need me to talk about it. But there's something two really important things that go hand in hand, maybe three, that are all operating right now. First of all, Donald Trump is not apparently, I'm sorry, I just hit delete again. Donald Trump is apparently not in control of the administration. He's pretty openly not able to answer anything that's going on. He throws questions to other people. If you hear him in interviews, he just sounds bonkers. He's not calling the shots. Two people at least are the ones running things. One is, or appear to be, one is Russell Vought at the Office of Management and Budget, and I'm not going to talk more about him today, I don't think. But the other is Stephen Miller, who is the White House Deputy Chief of Staff. White House advisor Miller is, according to The Guardian, the one who has ordered the strikes on the Venezuelan boats. A report out today says that he thinks this is a way to convince people that immigrants are terribly dangerous. At a time when, as I mentioned before, the Trump administration is deeply underwater on its attacks on immigrants, especially undocumented immigrants, because during the campaign, Trump said that he was only going to go after, the criminals, the rapists, the murderers. But what people didn't understand, and when I had an argument with somebody who was voting MAGA over this, what people didn't understand is the Trump administration considered anybody who had entered the country illegally a dangerous criminal because they had broken the law about not coming in without documentation. Now, that is not a felony, by the way, but they considered anybody who was undocumented a criminal. And that's what they did in the first term, and that's what they meant in the second term. But you had to read between the lines. Now you're seeing it played out, and people don't like it. They do not like losing their neighbor of 30 years. They do not like, watching mothers being torn away from their children. They do not like this. So you still see Trump and Kristi Noem and people like Miller talking about how immigrants are, criminals and terrible and so on. And yet support for immigration now, because of these attacks, is the highest it's been in years and years and years. People are like, wait a minute, we're a country of immigrants. And a little bit of a rabbit hole here. I just want to, well, never mind. Although it's killing me. I might come back to it. So he's apparently trying to convince people that these people in these boats are bringing in, as Trump said, enough drugs to kill. I think Trump said 30,000 people. Well, there's a real issue here in that the drugs that tend to kill people in the United States, the illicit drugs, because some of these drugs can be used in therapeutic ways as well, but the illicit drugs tend to be fentanyl, which comes from Mexico, from precursor chemicals that are made in China. And that's what the Biden administration worked to do, was to break that cycle so that China would crack down on the shipping of precursor chemicals. And the administration, that both the Mexican and the American administrations, were cracking down on the financing of what are essentially at this point factories building fentanyl in Mexico. But the people that the U.S. has been targeting have been from Venezuela, which does produce, I think it's cocaine. I'm sorry, I'm not really good on I'm better on where the interventions are than where the actual drugs are grown. But in any case, they do produce drugs, but it's not fentanyl. They produce something else. And at least one alleged wife of one of the people who died said, my husband was a fisherman. And of course, they're being struck way farther than they ever could have gotten across the water to the U.S. in those small boats. So it doesn't add up. I mean, the administration has never said has never shown any evidence to lawmakers or to the public that they're actually hitting drug dealers. They're just showing these videos of these boats blowing up, and they are truly horrific videos. I would urge you not to watch things with all the trauma that we're already going through, to not to watch the things that really you think will be a problem for you. I do try and watch them because I feel like I'm keeping a record and I need to see things, but they are profoundly disturbing. So if Miller's in charge of that, Miller also wants to get rid not only of undocumented immigrants, he wants to get rid of people of color altogether. And he has this fantasy of this sweep of stopping immigrants, of turning America into some fantasy version of his past. We have always been a country of immigrants. And the country, by the way, dates from the Constitution. Although we certainly have a precursor to that, but we've always been a nation of immigrants. His family is a nation of immigrants. I mean, his family is a family of immigrants. And when people talk about it always gets me when somebody like Bill O'Reilly or Sean Hannity talks about this great past before those people arrived, because in the 19th century, Irish Americans were literally not considered white, nor were Italian Americans. And so this idea of there was some pure white, I mean, whiteness really is a construct. I'm not going to go through that, but this idea that anyway, all right, that was the rabbit hole I wasn't going to get down. Anyway, Miller is really going after the purification of the country, in his words or in his ideology, into a white Christian nation, which it never has been, by the way. It just never has been. We had Muslims in one of the first non-indigenous people to set foot on what became the United States of America was a black Muslim man named Estevanico, which someday I'll do a video on. But anyway, I'll stop. But he has this fantasy of going back to what he thinks of this white world. But the problem with that is it involves getting rid of the Democrats who are protecting the idea of a multicultural democracy. So one of the things he is doing is he is trying to declare war on democratic cities, on cities where people of color vote, where women vote. And in order to do that, they've tried a number of different things. And one of the things that Stephen Miller is really pushing is the idea of Donald Trump invoking the Insurrection Act. The Insurrection Act is under Title 10 of the U.S. Code. The U.S. Code is our laws. They're available online if you ever want to look. They're pretty complicated, but they're not, they're divided up, so you can find this stuff pretty easily. And the Insurrection Act gives the president power to override the Posse Comitatus Act, which is from 1878, and says that the government cannot use federal troops against U.S. citizens to enforce, normal law enforcement. You can override that with the Insurrection Act, which is actually sort of a boiled down series of laws from a long period of time. Miller desperately wants Trump to invoke the Insurrection Act because, as he says, that gives Trump any power he wants. It gives him plenary power. I'm sure there's a question here about that. What this is all about is that there is a German political theorist named Carl Schmitt. I've talked about him before, named Carl Schmitt, and he looked at liberal democracies and he wasn't keen on how liberal democracies worked. And he said that liberal democracies, and this reflects the Constitution under which the Weimar Republic worked, but he said, if you have an escape clause, essentially, that says you have, and you can create an exception, that's where the power in that Constitution really resides. It's extra constitutional. You can go outside it. And I've talked a lot about how this administration is going outside the Constitution because you can declare an emergency and then do whatever you want. And if you can do that, you can make everything an emergency and you can get rid of liberal democracy. Well, Trump has announced, I believe it's declared 8 emergencies since he took power, a tariff emergency, an emergency at the border, and so on, to garner all this power. But if he invokes the Insurrection Act, according to Miller, he can do anything he wants. That's the plenary power. But somebody asked the other day, asked here, why did Miller do that the other day when he was talking to CNN and he said, well, as we know, under Title 10, if Trump invokes that, he has plenary power. And then Miller just stopped. But it wasn't a technical difficulty. Miller's eyes were still moving. It didn't go dead. Why did he just stop there? Well, maybe he had a brain freeze, which, by the way, I did once on a radio show. I completely forgot everything. I couldn't remember anything. My mind went completely black, and I'm just looking around my kitchen like, what am I doing here? So it can happen. It's only happened once, but like literally, I still am sitting there thinking, I'm on a radio show and I have no idea what to say next. There was a book tour probably 20 years ago. So maybe he just had a brain freeze. Or maybe he was playing to the one person who is his main audience. He is constantly on TV. Trump watches him, and he is feeding Trump these stories about how terrible the country is and how much power Trump has. And leaving that last word, plenary power, and then stopping, that's what everybody heard. That's what Trump heard. And that is clearly very much on Miller's mind. He desperately wants Trump to invoke the Insurrection Act, and that would give him the power to use the troops against the people that the administration is calling traitors, is calling un-American, is saying, they are now saying that anybody who speaks up against Trump is Antifa, which isn't even a thing. It's the idea that you don't want fascism. I guess I'm Antifa, right? And they're running this whole idea that there's this organized group of people who are somehow a conspiracy theory, which is just bonkers. I'm sorry, just bonkers. So that idea of getting Trump to agree to invoke the Insurrection Act is part of what's going on with these. They are clearly showing him videos of Portland in 2020 when he talks about boarded up plywood windows, for example. That was actually the case on the main square of Portland in certain places in 2020. It's not at all the case today. I mean, there's before the judge who just took on a case about the deployment of National Guard troops in Portland said, there were 20 people at the ICE facility, and they were, giving you the middle finger. That is not an insurrection. That's protest. There's just no reason to call out any kind of troops. So that whole concept of creating an insurrection and saying you can put troops on the streets because of that is, to go back to that question, very much about 2026. It is very clear to everybody that this administration is profoundly unpopular, and that when it goes, not if it goes, when it goes, we're going to look at an entirely new country. And so those people who are wedded to the idea of their ideology of Christian nationalism or of white nationalism in Miller's case, or even just of power, even just people who want to be making bank on this administration, as a number of them are doing everything they can to hold on to that power. And this is part of the whole attempt to keep the idea of there being an insurrection going on in Chicago or Portland. Why those cities? Somebody asked here, because Portland, I think they thought might be easy after 2020 to get people to turn out and create a situation that might look as if it were an insurrection. LA, similarly. Chicago, because it would be a real prize for Trump, because J.B. Pritzker is there, and because he has he resents J.B. Pritzker so profoundly. So what I thought I would do today was to go ahead and answer the questions that I had time to call. If you want to try and shoot them to me while I'm talking, I'm going to try. I mean, there is now an ability for me to see these things, which there hasn't been. So we'll go ahead and see if you want to shoot me something that I can answer. I'm happy to try. But let me start with the questions I did manage to pull as quickly as I did, and I'll try and riff on them so that we cover some real ground here that dives into history as well. So let's start with some of the questions that people threw out once, right at the very beginning. And that is, of course, now I can't find the first one I set up here. It's right here at the very top. Why is Joe Manchin of West Virginia, Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, opposing the Democrats? Somebody asked. Joe Manchin is a Democrat. So in a way, he isn't opposing the Democrats because he is one. But he's an interesting place to start because, and I step back a little bit here, the idea that we have two parties that are this ideologically split is not the norm in America really since at least World War II, when the parties tended to be big tents. And so I'm going to step back and take another step back here and say that political scientists look at the American system and they say, yeah, so technically it kind of looks like the American system only has two parties. But the reality is that while other countries have a number of splits in their party system, so they have 7 parties or whatever, basically America also has those splits, but they have these big tent parties in which people find their homes. So you could, in the 1970s, for example, have Democrats who came out on opposite sides of questions. And one of the things that kind of big tent party did was it permitted there to be a lot of overlap in the middle, so that you might not get all the Democrats on board for a piece of legislation, but you would get some Republicans, and therefore you would manage to find a center, a vital center, as one historian called it, in order to keep the country kind of glued together. Now, with the polarization of the Republican Party, and this is asymmetrical. Now, one of the things that people talk about is, oh, the parties have gotten so polarized. No, the Republican Party has polarized dramatically. And any chart will show you this. The Democratic Party really hasn't changed very much. It has always kind of been there to the left of center, and in fact, many members of the Republican Party have slid to the right with the sliding of the Republican Party so far out to the right as it has. Which, by the way, might be to the left. I'm pointing. I don't know. Well, in any case. The Republicans have slid a long way, and as they have done so, the parties have pulled apart because the people who are willing to work with the Republicans have gone with them out there into the right-wing wilderness. And the Democrats have tended to vote in a block to try and stand against the Republicans. But people like Joe Manchin are sort of the old guard, not that he's not a particularly old man, but sort of that old idea of, I care about the basic principles of the Democratic Party, but I don't agree with them on other issues. And I don't know Manchin well enough, having not prepped here, to say exactly where the differences are. But he is now, there are many people in the Democratic Party who are very angry with him about about what he did with the hearing for Neera Tanden for the Office of Management and Budget, which is quite an important position, where he said he thought her tweets were mean, so he didn't like her. The reality might be that. It might also be that she is more progressive than he is comfortable dealing with. And so instead of saying, well, I don't like her because I don't like her politics, he is instead choosing to say, I didn't like the mean tweets, which is rich coming from anybody who voted, for example, for Rick Grinnell to be Trump, to work for the Trump administration, because he was horrible on Twitter. So Manchin is a larger story to my mind. He is at this moment where we're trying to figure out what the parties are going to look like and what it means to be either a Republican or a Democrat. So one of the things that jumped out to me about Manchin yesterday was that it is hard to avoid looking at the way that he is talking about Neera Tanden and also about the nominee for Interior Department, the Indigenous woman who's been nominated for to run the Interior Department, without noticing that these are both women and women of color. And one wonders the degree to which being uncomfortable with women and people of color in power plays into Manchin's position. And that's something that will not probably fly in the Democratic Party in the way that it used to. Remember, the Democrats used to be the party of white supremacy. They switched positions with the Republicans in the 1960s. But But that's not going to fly. Being somewhat politically conservative in terms of economic issues might very well fly with the Democrats. So Manchin is himself a Democrat, but I think probably a sign either of the past of the party or of its future. And it's not clear to me which that's going to be. He's definitely the person to be watching, or one of the people to be watching in this moment, because he's signaled that he's on board, for example, for the coronavirus package, the $1.9 trillion coronavirus package, so long as it doesn't contain things that he considers too far to the left. And he wants some Republicans to sign on board. So there's a lot of moving pieces here. But he's more of a sign of the past, I think, than of any kind of new. He's not really a Democrat. Remember, if the Democrats push him out, that seat will almost certainly go to a Republican, and that's a problem for the Democratic Party. So, there's a couple ways to think about American politics, and one of them is to say we need to be pure, and one of them is to say we need to have bigger tents so that we can nail together coalitions where we need them to do the big stuff. But he's an interesting person to be watching. All right, so somebody is saying thank you for the captions. Perhaps that means that they are now putting captions under these, which would be lovely. Will Rogers, I'm not a member of an organized political party. I'm a Democrat. And you know what? That's not illegitimate nowadays. And I'm going to get to another question about that. All right. I'm not seeing anything else there that is jumping out here. So a couple other things to start with here. So that's what's up with Manchin. Now, other people have asked, why is Trump more in the news than Biden is? And this is a great question. There's a number of answers to it, I think. And one of them, first of all, is we need to be weaned off Trump. There is a way in which he made news reporters' jobs very easy because the story was right there. And I say this with experience, because there was that blissful moment when he was completely silent. And I remember sitting at my computer at night, as I do, and thinking, what am I going to write about? I mean, the stories have all written themselves. What's here now? And there was this moment where I realized I too had to be weaned off this is what we need to react to because this is what Trump is doing thing. So first of all, I think it's the fact that we kind of need to be weaned off of that instant, here's your story for today. But there's more than that. Part of the reason that Trump was so very politically powerful and why he drew eyeballs is because most people, when they interact with others, do so with some preparation or with some modicum of planning. And one of the things that he did, very much in an entertainment kind of style, to be honest, was to explode. He was when he was in front of a camera or when he was in charge, you didn't know what was going to happen next. So you had to watch. You had to watch either because you thought it was cool, or you had to watch because you were horrified and you needed to keep your eye on the ball to see whether you were in danger or not. And this was one of the things that really propelled his early campaign. If you remember, you may not remember this, it was memorable to me because somebody pointed it out to me. We did not used to wake up and reach for our phones. Your phone was something that was maybe in the other room or whatever, and you certainly used it. But I'd go to bed sometimes at night and I wouldn't have my phone next to the bed, and I sure wouldn't wake up and look at it. But once he was in office, you felt like you had to look and see what was happening because you wanted to know what the day was going to look like. Is the stock market going to crash? Is there going to be a pandemic? Are we going to be at war with Iran? Remember how often we were afraid about being at war with Iran? So he exploded onto the scene. And it's hard to take your eyes off of that because I think probably as humans, we're wired to watch for danger. But also because even still, he's not unimportant. So when he threatens to show up at CPAC, as it's called, the Conservative Political Action Committee conference this weekend, and say that he's the presumptive leader of the Republican Party. Now, for what it's worth, I'm not at all convinced he is the presumptive leader of the Republican Party, but it's certainly news that he's saying so. So people are also continuing to feature him because he still is important, especially as the state legislatures are trying more and more often to do what he says. I'll say more about that in a minute. But then finally, I think people are paying attention to him and less to Biden right now, because Biden is quite deliberately reinstating the norms and the traditions of our government. So if you remember back when when Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer were negotiating with Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin and the White House over the last coronavirus package, that was kind of blow by blow. Every day there's these two groups, these three people really fighting about what was going to be in the package. That's not normal. That's not how legislation is normally passed. So, for example, out of the box, Joe Biden talked about, and Kamala Harris talked about this $1.9 trillion coronavirus package, and Jen Psaki, is the White House press secretary, talked about it in front of the press, and then it went off to congressional committees. And congressional committees marked it up. And that's not very interesting work in terms of following who's done what, in the sense that, it's kind of interesting for nerds like me. It's actually really interesting for nerds like me. But realistically, how many of you want to look through a bill and see lines crossed out and new numbers written in? It's interesting once there's a final deal. But do we really care about the fact they're going to argue, and I'm making this up, but it's an example from my first book, there's a really long congressional argument about whether a barrel of sugar should be taxed at 2.25 cents a barrel or 2.5 cents a barrel. And that's not interesting, right? The ultimate outcome is important because it says about how they thought the value of sugar was important to America and all kinds of stuff like that. But the actual process of getting there, you got to really love that kind of stuff in order to care about that. So it's much harder right now to be watching the administration and to be commenting on the administration because it's not doing anything. Or rather, it's not, everything is right now with Congress. Biden did a lot of stuff of early executive actions that I hope to talk about in a little bit. But then once those are kind of done, he's doing the best he can to be out there in front of the cameras. Last night's very moving ceremony about our half a million official deaths from coronavirus was moving, and it was beautifully staged. And it, by the way, I have no inside knowledge on this at all, but I wonder if Dr. Biden had a say in that staging, because she's very good visually, and I thought that was visually beautifully staged. He's doing things, but you could miss that ceremony and not worry that the world was going to collapse. So it's a little harder for people to keep their eyes on Biden. That being said, I think it's important that we do so, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. All right, so more questions here, quick questions, and that I will answer to the best of my ability here. First of all, somebody wanted to know, will Mazars USA, Trump's accountants, really turn over his financial records now? And the story behind that, of course, is that from the very beginning, before he went into office, former President Trump promised to release his tax returns when the audit was over. Well, of course, there's no law that says you can't turn them over, even if there is an audit underway. And the audit to which he was referring apparently was the fact that he claimed huge losses on his business and got reimbursed, I believe it's to the tune of about $72 million from the IRS, only to have the IRS say, hey, wait a minute, we think you cheated on that, and to try and claw that money back. So that apparently was what was going on. But so he never did release those taxes. He kept promising that he was going to. He never did, and he has fought it tooth and nail. Well, yesterday, as it went up through the courts kept saying, yeah, dude, you got to hand over your financials, because there are actually two different groups looking for them. But the entity that was in the news yesterday was Cyrus Vance from New York, Manhattan, and he's trying to chase down what appears to have been and again, all of these things are alleged until they're proven in a court of law. It's something to remember. It appears that the hush money that was apparently paid to Stormy Daniels to make sure she didn't talk before the election about her relationship with the former president, or then the candidate running for office, appears to have been paid illegally. And That's so Vance is looking into that. A grand jury requested to see Trump's taxes and financials. And by the way, that's a grand jury who asked for that, not one individual himself. And the courts all along kept saying, yeah, you've got to hand those over. And he kept fighting it until it went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court yesterday said, no, we're not going to see this. We're not going to review this question. The decision of the previous court stands. And because that decision of the previous court was they had to hand him over, so that's what stands now. They got handed over. So somebody asked, are they really going to do it? Well, let's think that one through. You're an accounting firm, and a big one. Mazars is international. And you have a client who is that visible. And it appears that that client has done something that may or may not be illegal. And a lot of people want access to those finances. Are you going to hide them? Are you going to be willing to put your neck on the chopping block for him? And the answer to that is, I can't see any reason why. I mean, they said at the last iteration of this case, they said, yeah, sure, we're going to hand them over. They're all ready to go. Because again, they're electronic. It's just a question of hitting the send button. And I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it's not that these are going to tie up people for years and years and years to find out at this point. So will they turn them over? I would say absolutely. But remember that there are literally millions of pages of paper in them. And certainly they have an interest in delivering everything they possibly can, so that nobody can come to them and say, you didn't turn in the memo from wherever. And also, if there is wrongdoing in them, it's going to be hidden. There is, and I don't mean necessarily deliberately, but if you have committed a crime, and I'm just saying this, sort of throwing it out there, you're not going to have done it on every single piece. I mean, think of your own taxes. Like my tax packet is really thick, and lots of it's blank pages. And if I were committing a crime, which believe me, I'm not, because I don't even understand the numbers. I have someone else do it. It wouldn't be on every page. So they're going to have to look for that, and it's going to take a really long time. I would be shocked unless they know exactly what they're looking for, which they might. I don't know. I'm not a forensic accountant. If they know exactly what they're looking for, maybe it'll be sooner than I think. But I would not go to bed tonight expecting they're going to turn up anything by tomorrow. That's not going to happen. They are going to turn something up. And one of the reasons that this is so interesting for someone like me, and one of the reasons that the government tended to get organized crime figures for things like tax evasion, is because it's very difficult to prove cases where you have to wonder about someone's intent, or, like the emoluments clause of the Constitution. Did former President Trump break the emoluments clause? To my mind, almost certainly. But I'm some woman sitting here on the coast of Maine. Where's the law? What law did he break? Where are the numbers? And the thing about financials is their numbers on pieces of paper. And you can say, look, the number over here is X and the number over here is Y. Those don't match. That's a crime. So that's one of the reasons that financial crimes are so very, very interesting to me, and why I love documents and numbers, because you can actually see what happened. And this is one of the reasons that I study laws, because you can see how the laws, literally, they print them all out. And there's actually two major scandals in our history where they changed the law between the time they voted on it and the time it got printed. In both cases, somewhat importantly. And you could chase down exactly who did that. So it was kind of cool. So I just saw flashing by here somebody saying the fact that CNN is no longer covering Biden's press conferences. And that's true. And that's, to my mind, a huge problem. But that, I think, speaks to the fact that Jen Psaki is telling people honestly what's going on. And that doesn't necessarily draw a lot of eyeballs. When it was Trump suggesting people should, perhaps inject themselves with bleach, it got a lot of eyeballs, right? If Jen Psaki is up there saying, well, we're going to follow through with this treaty or whatever, it's people feel like they can catch that later on. I still think it's a problem, but that's what it is. A couple of tidbits here, not that I have time for this, but a couple of tidbits here is that it is my understanding that press room in the White House is actually the room that was added on for FDR to be able to swim because of his polio. He credited swimming with strengthening his legs. So he had a swimming pool put in the White House so he could continue to swim. And when JFK took the White House in 61, his father came and said, "It looks like a YMCA. This is awful." So he went ahead and had murals painted on the walls, and those murals are now in the JFK Library in Boston, because the deal was that if they ever stopped using it as a swimming pool, they would take the murals back, that the Kennedys would take the murals back, it is my understanding. And it is also my understanding that that room became the press room during the Carter administration, and all the wiring they need to make the press room happen is now in what was in the pool area. Isn't that cool? All right, so that's some of them. Was some more questions. Somebody asked something. As people are saying that on Rachel Maddow's show last night, somebody who used to work for Cyrus Vance says they will go through the paperwork quite quickly. I'm wondering about what quickly means to somebody like that. But like I say, I'm not a forensic accountant. It's entirely likely they know what they're looking for. I know I have worked with forensic accountants in the past, and they're wizards. I look at numbers and they can find anything. And so that's sort of interesting. All right, what else am I seeing here? All right, so people are asking now about propaganda. All right, I'm going to come over here now. So a couple of things here that people have asked about. How we got for time? We got some time here. People have asked here about where should we go here? Let me start here with and see if I can get into some of these questions sort of backward. Yes, Sarah Walsh. I had been pronouncing Saki's name as Pisaki, and that's incorrect. It's Saki. I did look it up the other day. So you don't pronounce the P. One of those names that I thought about. I usually look up all of pronunciations, and I just didn't that one because I thought I had it, and I was dead wrong. All right, so. Someone just says the press room is very tiny. I've never seen it, but that would be in keeping with the idea of it being an old-fashioned swimming pool. All right. So, and someone says I got that right, which is good. All right. So the question, voter suppression. So let's go here with the big lie, which people have asked about. So you're hearing the term the big lie being told a lot about where we are in government right now. And the big lie is this. The big lie is, first of all, untrue, which seems like I need to say it, but it's pretty obvious. And it is a setup for a minority political group to take power by telling their supporters that the supporters have been cheated. And the big lie today is that Joe Biden did not win the 2020 election. He did. He won by more than 7 million votes in the popular vote and by 306 electoral votes to 232 electoral votes for Donald Trump. Those are big margins, and they are big margins, especially at a time when he was running as an outsider against an incumbent. It's very difficult to get traction against an incumbent for any number of reasons. First of all, they have the eyes of people on them. They're doing a lot of stuff. And there's not been such a big overturning of an incumbent in office before Joe Biden since Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1932. This was a big deal. All right. And it was a big deal, especially at a time when, for example, in Florida and in Texas and in Georgia, there was a big attempt, and maybe other states as well, there were big attempts on the parts of the Republicans to make sure the vote did not get out. And there was also the national level, people like Louis DeJoy at the head of the United States Postal Service trying to slow down mail-in voting, right? So there were a lot of reasons that this is a big deal. He won the election. And so, of course, Trump and his supporters were trying to argue that he didn't win the election. So first of all, they launched all kinds of lawsuits, all but one of which was either dismissed for lack of evidence or decided against them. So they lost, I believe it's either 63 or 64 lawsuits. They won one that was purely operational. It was not pro forma, but not important. It was about, I believe it was where people were standing in the to observe the count. There were members of both Democrats and Republicans watching the count in every state. That's how it's done. And there were recounts any place that the Trump campaign wanted them. Those all came out the way they should have come out. And the state legislatures, or however each state certifies their ballots, all agreed that Joe Biden won this election. It's not contested. In 2018, we developed a new office of cybersecurity in the country. The guy who was in charge of that, a man named Christopher Krebs, who I suspect is a very interesting part of the story, to be honest, because I think probably people overlooked him, and he did his job. And so he did his job really well, and was able to say with great confidence that this was a very secure election. Again, once the ballots came in, I have my doubts about how many people were kept from voting, but that's a subject I'm going to get to in a minute. So Joe Biden won this election. But the Republicans are now arguing, first of all, they argued that he did not. Then they argued that they were fake ballots. Then you saw all this, and one thing after another got knocked down. Then they came up with the idea that because a number of the states changed their voting laws because of the pandemic, that this was illegal because it's a little bit complicated, but because of the way the state constitutions are written and the idea that state legislatures are the only ones who should be able to affect the system. Never mind, I'm not going to go into it now. But the point is, they're trying to argue that Trump actually won that election. He didn't. I mean, there's just nothing else I can say. He didn't. But what that does is it enables Trump supporters to believe that they, in fact, are the good Americans by trying to defend our democracy against Joe Biden, who in their mind is the illegitimate president. So the big lie is hugely damaging because it's not just Trump who's advancing it. It's people like Steve Scalise on the TV on Sunday. I don't even know what day of the week it is today, but on Sunday, he refused to admit that Joe Biden had won the election. He said there were irregularities in the states. The way the states handled it was not okay. Like all these Republicans who are now talking about unity, Mitt Romney from Utah, a Republican from Utah, formerly of Massachusetts, now of Utah, said, you start talking about unity about the time you admit you were lying about the election being stolen. The election was not stolen, and that big lie, the idea that Joe Biden is not the legitimate president, the fact that certain lawmakers on the Republican side continue to say that he was not legitimately elected, and refused to say he was legitimately elected, gives cover to people like Jessica Watkins from the Capitol riot, whose lawyers have argued in court that she is not responsible for what she did because she was defending the president, because the president said, we have to go stop this steal. Remember, stop the steal. That was the whole point of all those stop the steal signs. And So let me finish with what that means, but how we got here. That stop the steal gives cover to these people to continue to say that the Democrats who are now in charge are illegitimate. Well, think about, without me saying it because I don't like to talk about this, think about what that means. If somebody has stolen your government, how should you treat them? And then let me tell you that is precisely what happened in the American South after 1889, really 1890, when Democrats in the South said that Republican voters, who were primarily African American, were stealing control of the government. So what did they do? They got rid of those black voters. And they did so either by suppressing their votes or on a lynching campaign. And this is extraordinarily dangerous language. It is unthinkable. But let's see where it's playing out. It's playing out right now in the fact that the Republican Party has a really big problem. And the really big problem is the fact that they're not popular. About 25% of the American people still still consider themselves registered Republicans. And that last data point was taken before the January 6th insurrection, when we know that the Republican Party has hemorrhaged at least 140,000 voters, which in different states will matter a lot. That's not a small amount, and that's that's the last set of numbers I saw. Mind you, I have a full-time job, so I don't look at these things all the time, but I do look a lot. So Republicans are only 25% of the electorate anyway. So that's a problem, and their policies are not popular. They're just not popular. So what are they going to do, and how have they managed to stay in power? They've managed to stay in power by suppressing the vote, by making sure that people who disagree with them can't vote. And I've written about this recently in my letters. And this is what you're seeing across the country right now in Republican states. They're working to destroy the ability of Democrats to get to the polls. They're actively trying and saying that's what they're doing to make sure that Democrats can vote. Well, what does that look like? What does that mean if you say that Democrats aren't allowed to vote? Well, yes, you're going to end up with Republicans in power, but there's no longer a democracy. And one of the things that I like to remind people of about is that there were always elections held in the American South between 1880 and the 1960s. Like, there were votes. I mean, they had votes, right? There were polls, and people went to the polls, and there were even campaigns. But you couldn't win unless you were a white male Democrat, because they simply wouldn't let anybody else vote. So we could do the same thing at our national level. We have a precedent for that, but I don't think that's going to fly. But I do think that that's what the point of the big lie right now is, to say to the state legislators in places like Georgia, you need to guarantee that we can't have another stolen election. And now, by definition, an election that is won by Democrats is stolen in their minds. And I've written before about how that came through the Republican Party. That argument came through the Republican Party. And why it is so powerful now. But so that's what the big lie is. Now, people have said to me, what can we do about the big lie? Like, how do you push back against any of this? And so I'm going to give you, usually I do this at the end, but it seems like a natural place to do it right here. There are many ways that you can push back against the government going in a direction that you don't like. And I'm going to line up a bunch of them, and then I'm going to tell you what I think. So the obvious things are: run for office, give money to causes you care about, and tell your legislators at all levels, or your lawmakers at all levels, what you like and what you don't like. Here's a newsflash: nobody likes to get phone calls saying, I'm really unhappy with the fact you did X. But at the same time, you can also call a lawmaker and say, I'm really proud of the fact you did Y. And that matters. People like positive feedback. So that is one way to go ahead and change the political landscape in America today. But I'm an idealist, which means that I believe that you change government by changing people's ideas. And I'm also of the belief that you change ideas by changing the popular culture. So what I always urge people to do is to take up oxygen. And I always say that, and you're like, what are you talking about? And I'm talking about how you can call people out. And I don't mean necessarily being in their faces, although that could certainly be something to do, depending on what your personality is like. When they say untrue things, when they say that Joe Biden didn't win, and that doesn't necessarily have to be a really angry in your face thing. Like, what kind of evidence do you have for that? Because everything that I've seen says that the state signed off. That standing up and saying, no, that big lie is not true, or do you really want to live in a place where people can't vote? Or mail-in voting actually isn't better for one party or the other. It wasn't until Trump got involved with it. Asking questions and staying engaged, with this exception. People write to me all the time and say, I've got an uncle who spews this stuff and I don't want to be with him, and how do I change his mind? You don't. People make their own decisions ultimately. And I always liken this to that friend we all have who's been in a bad relationship. And the more you say to that friend, come on, she's being horrible to you, you deserve better, the tighter that person clings to that bad relationship. The only thing you can do is model a good relationship and say, I don't like the way she talks to you, or I don't like the way he talks to you. I'd rather not be with him because I don't like the way he talks to you. I miss you when you're not with us. Can't you come out sometimes? If you think about it that way, all you can do is model a better way of being. And remember that it takes, I think it's 7 tries for somebody in an abusive relationship to leave one. It's not easy. So you're not going to get your uncle or any of the people that you can probably think of in the public eye who are spouting stuff that you think is abhorrent to say, oh my God, you're right. I should have seen it this way all the time. That's not going to happen. Many of them are lost, but their kids aren't. And maybe somebody who is Biden curious isn't. And that's maybe the best way to approach that, and not to keep trying to convert your cousin, because it ain't going to happen. And that's just, we make our own choices. That's the way it's going to be. All right. So, somebody wants, isn't that interesting? One person is not moving. Everybody else is moving past this person. Somehow you have nailed yourself here. What's the issue about March 4th? People are asking. March 4th, 2021, that is now, QAnon is now suggesting that that's the date at which Donald Trump is actually going to take his second oath of office, because that's the traditional date for president to take the oath. Until Franklin Delano Roosevelt, it was always in March. So it's just one of the many secret plans that they think are going on that are not, but that can cause a lot of damage. And I expect that it's not going to be a calm day that day. But this is certainly something that the police are all over at this point. Somebody asked, didn't Trump vote by absentee ballot? Yes, he did. So did Melania. Okay. A couple more things here that you are asking about. Thing about voter suppression that I was just talking about at the state level. Somebody asked about, don't we need that Voting Rights Act? If you may or may not be aware of this, I think I might have written about it recently, but I don't know. I actually keep a lot of tabs open, and I don't always use them all, because I figure they're going to come back around, and they always do. And that's that the first thing that both the House and the Senate introduced this year was a Voting Rights Act. It's called the For the People Act. And the House has passed it in the past. Now it's coming up again. It does a number of things. It doesn't simply protect the right of everybody to vote. It also keeps big money out of politics. And it, I think it ends gerrymandering. I can't remember. It's not in front of me. It does a number of the things that one thinks we need in order to restore the concept of one person, one vote, which is is from the early 20th century. It is quite likely not going to pass unless the Democrats get rid of the filibuster, which I'll talk about in a minute. But it's a really interesting thing, and let me kind of dig a little bit into it. So, if you think about our democracy is old, and it's kind of creaky in a lot of ways. So one of the things that we are still grappling with is the relationship between states and the federal government. And this is really at the heart of many of our issues nowadays. And I would love to tell you that there's a really clear, obvious solution to these tensions, but I really don't think there is. I'm actually working on a project right now where I'm trying to suss this out, and it's very complicated. And I would love to say, oh, these people are just stupid, here's the answer. But that's not entirely true. And where I'm going with that is that the way our system was originally set up, it was states that had the right to determine who got to vote within those states. The federal government only picked up the right to determine who got to vote with the 15th Amendment. And with the 15th, it kind of flirted with it with the 14th, but with the 15th Amendment, it said that you couldn't discriminate based on race or previous condition of servitude, but that's it. It says where you can't discriminate, but it isn't actively proactive. So if you look at those laws that I talked about, the For the People Act, it's quite long. The law is quite long, but the whole beginning of it is an attempt to prove that it is constitutional for the Congress to step in and make laws about how people can vote. Now, in other countries, it's a no-brainer, but in our country, it's not a no-brainer yet, and that's That's something that's behind that law that's going to make it a little bit more difficult than it is probably in other countries where they don't have that issue of federalism to trip over when they're trying to make sure that people vote. Similarly, there's a lot of attempts to kind of go around the question of voter suppression, because one of the ways that voter suppression is most effective is not by saying you can't vote because you're, have blue eyes or whatever, but by saying, of course, everybody can vote. And then just making sure that the mechanics make it impossible, for example, for somebody on an indigenous reservation to vote. Put the voting machines so far away from the reservation that you basically would lose a whole day to get out to them. Or if you live in an inner city where you have, many people trying to converge to vote, you make sure there's only 4 voting machines. Whereas out in the suburbs, you make sure there are 30. That is not something that's covered by our laws currently. And there's a number of ways that people are trying to work around that. So, for example, E.J. Dionne and Norm Ornstein have suggested the idea of making voting mandatory, which I was always against, because I'm like, if you don't want to show up, that's a choice too. But they brought me around on that one by saying that if you did that, what it would do is it would shift the burden of the state from trying to keep people from voting to enabling them to vote. So it would change the burden on the state, not on the individual. And that I thought was really interesting, because then the state would have an interest in getting people through as quickly as they possibly could. Something that Mark Elias of Democracy Docket, who is fighting all these cases in court, came up with today, or at least published today that I saw, was to say that you don't need to make it mandatory to vote, but what you do need to do is pass a law that says that everybody can vote within 30 minutes. And if you're in line and you can't vote in 30 minutes, then the state is charged a certain sum of money for every minute over which you are left in line. And that would get prohibitive really fast. So that's his suggestion. That seemed to me it might be a little bit hard to figure out the numbers, but there are ways in which people are trying to deal with that. All right, so that's what's going on with the National Voting Rights Act. I'm also going to touch, I think, here on the filibuster again, because we are currently saddled with 2 holdovers from the early years in our democracy that are tripping us up in a big way right now. And the first is the Electoral College. I talk about that a lot. And I want to emphasize again that the Electoral College, as it was originally conceived, was nothing like it is today, because the founders did not expect there to be political parties. So they really believed that what one would do is to go ahead and elect from your state men of substance, people who knew the world, because otherwise, if you're in Georgia, how are you going to know what some leading man in Massachusetts is like? So the idea was to create these electors who would get together and they would argue, and they would say, well, my man George is great, and no, my man, John is great. And then they would decide who they thought were the best candidates to go ahead and be the leaders of the Republic. And oftentimes they expected that would get thrown into the House of Representatives, which when it finally was such a complete disaster, they changed the Constitution. But the idea was that there would really be this jockeying for the best. What happened was that in 1896, the first real election where George Washington wasn't a shoo-in, Thomas Jefferson loses to John Adams, and who he loathes, and he recognizes that if his state of Virginia had not split its electoral votes, he would have won. So he gets his people in Virginia to go ahead and declare a winner-takes-all system in Virginia, and he wins in 1800. And once that happens, everybody else recognizes that with this new advent of political parties at the end of the 1700s, you must go ahead and deliver your electoral votes as a block, or your guy's never going to get elected. So we get this winner-take-all system that is horrifying to people like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. James Madison actually goes far enough to try to to write a constitutional amendment to go back to what's called the district rule. Now, people have said to me, well, if you look at the district rule, it wouldn't really have made a difference in the last election. But I would counter that with, that's because people run now as if it doesn't matter. If in fact you did have to compete in every state for a proportion of the vote, you'd campaign very differently, and you wouldn't go to simply those few states that are going to be determining the outcome of the election. So that's one way in which the Electoral College, in which each state gets the number of senators and representatives that it has otherwise. That's one way in which it has changed. It has also changed dramatically because I believe it was in 1929, the Congress capped the number of people who would be in the House of Representatives. And they do so because they recognize that the rural states are losing desperately in terms of population to the urban states. And the rural states say, hey, we got a problem here. Let's cap where the number of seats that you can have in Congress, in the House of Representatives. Congress, by the way, is both houses, but in the House of Representatives. And when they do that, what that means is that what had previously been a representative for every certain number of people, all of a sudden the numbers of people that would be covered by a representative go way higher, which means that the really big states are have disproportionately much fewer representatives than they would have if they had kept the original ratio that the founders set out. So big states are now seriously underrepresented in our Electoral College. So we're simply not using it the way it was set up to be used. And that's something that I think we really have to throw on the table. People keep saying, oh, we can't throw it out because it's traditional. Well, fine, let's go back to the traditional version then, in which case our entire system is going to be changed dramatically because we're going to get rid of winner take all. We're going to go back to districts, and we're going to actually increase the number of representatives for the very populous states. The other place that the founders' plan has been really perverted is with the filibuster. And the filibuster, as I've talked about before, is a reflection of the fact that in the House of Representatives, they had to come up with a rule early on to stop people from talking. And basically, because the Senate is smaller, they never had to do that. And the filibuster was originally just a way for somebody to just keep talking, to mean that they would never get to a vote. They would just keep talking. And this was used in the 19th and early 20th centuries as a way to stop civil rights legislation from getting through. But what happened was that as the Senate got more and more business, this was a real pain to have people stopping up business for days and days and days. And so they changed the system so that you don't have to any longer talk to stop vote. You only have to say you're going to. And what that means is effectively a very small percentage of the Senate that represents a very small percentage of the American people can effectively stop even very, very popular pieces of legislation by simply saying, oh, we'd stop that if we could. You needed 60 votes to get that measure passed. So, for example, there's a new book out by Adam Gentleson called Kill Switch, which is really interesting, and about the Senate. And he opens it with the attempt by Harry Reid to get passed through Congress basic common sense gun control legislation after the Sandy Hook shooting. 55 senators, the House of Representatives passed it. The American people, over 70% of them, as I recall, approved of it. 55 senators approved it. But the remaining 45 senators who represented, and I don't remember off the top of my head what percentage of Americans it was, but I think it was under 40%, stopped it. So they managed to kill that because they were in the pockets of the NRA. And the filibuster then becomes this really wildly anti-majority new tool used very, very differently than it ever was in the 19th or early 20th centuries. And it's profoundly anti-democratic. And it's also not what the founders intended. They expected there to be deliberative debate, and then they expected a majority in the Senate to be able to pass something or not. And so right now we're really crippled with the filibuster, which again I would not have said in the past. So somebody asked, doesn't that change the whole meaning of? Did I say 1896? Sorry about that. Does that change the whole meaning of the different forms of representation versus in the House versus the Senate? No, both were supposed to be majority rule houses. They have different, their representation is different, and that was supposed to make a difference. And crucially also, the House turns over every 2 years, so it changes really quickly. The Senate only turns over, a third of it turns over every 2 years, so it's much slower. So the idea is that it'll be more conservative in the true conservative sense. That is, it's not going to be subject to the whims of the moment the way the House is. But in terms of both being a majority vote, no, that's how they were designed to operate. All right. So another question here. People have asked a lot about the return of the Fairness Doctrine. And I talk a lot about the Fairness Doctrine and how the fall of the Fairness Doctrine in 1987 under Ronald Reagan and his appointees to the Federal Communications Commission opened the door for talk radio. And people have said we need to get that back. But here's the problem with it. I agree. I mean, I agree that our speech in some form needs to eliminate lying, deliberate lying, and fake accounts. But the Fairness Doctrine is not necessarily in America the way to do that for this reason. The Fairness Doctrine was linked to having a government license. So, if you're going to get a license from the government can say to you, well, you have to behave in certain ways. Like when I drive my car, I have to wear my glasses. I can't get my license until I say, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and wear my glasses. The fact I couldn't find my car without my glasses is beside the point. The point is, once I'm in the car, I have to have my glasses on. I have a license. 1987 was the rise of cable and of private organizations handling media, handling news. And because of our First Amendment, it's very difficult for the government to put limitations on what you can say on a private venue. So it's not like we can just flip a switch and say, oh yeah, we can have the Fairness Doctrine back, because you no longer need a broadcast license. Like, nobody is regulating what I say here, except to the degree Facebook decides it doesn't want me to say something, and they can take away my platform because it's a private platform. I don't have any inherent right to be here. There's a little bit of tangledness in that there is some tangling in all that, by the way. It's not quite as starkly as I'm putting it, but the point is that the government can't simply flip a switch and say, oh no, from now on, Facebook can't handle these 16 people, but they can handle these 16 people in America. It can do that in other countries. Governments can do that because their systems are different than ours. But our government is bound by our Constitution that it cannot regulate speech. The government can. Private companies can. The government can't. So one of the things that I think about a lot going forward is how do we regulate what is acceptable in public discourse going forward? And part of that is also tied up with access. So you can control what people says by whether or not they have access to it. And that's something that I think is really dangerous to put in the hands of private organizations, because they have different interests. They want to make money more than they want to protect democracy. But I will, so I don't have the answer here. To my mind, we need to find a way to protect a place of public discourse that does not get taken over by lies, and by lies that are spread by hostile actors, whether they're governments, foreign governments, or plutocrats or whatever. But it's going to take lawyers and people to figure out what that looks like. I will say, though, I really, really firmly believe that democracy does not have within it a suicide pact. Like, if this is destroying our democracy, let's figure out a way out of it. And one of the things that I always think about is that we are kind of with the new technology of the internet in what I like to call, mythologically, it's not what it was really like, the Wild West. And what happened in at first, everyone's like, this is great. We're gonna discover world peace on the internet. And then the bad actors started coming in, and it turned into a complete mess. And then now you can see people trying to clean it up. and what that's going to look like to clean it up. And I don't know what that's going to look like, but I do know that when in communities in the West, when women came in and established churches and schools and community centers and all that, the guys who'd been shooting the places up hated it. They insisted that this was destroying everything. And yet it was actually when the communities cleaned up that they became decent place to live. All right, so one more thing here. Let's see. Somebody asked, will Garland survive the Judiciary Committee? I would be shocked if he does not. Really, really good candidate. And somebody asked here, Hiram Cordingley, I'm going to call you out here. Why didn't anybody do anything back in the day when places in the South were allowed to erect statues and name streets and buildings after Confederate war heroes? Mind you, people always sound smarter than when I paraphrase what they say. So if that wasn't grammatically right, it was me, not him. And the answer to this is really interesting, because at the turn of the last century, the 1890s and the 1900s and going forward, all these Confederate statues that are now coming down were erected then. People think they were associated with the Civil War. They were not. They were associated with the late 19th century, and they were associated with a moment in which Americans, especially in the West and in the South, had come to associate the idea of a government that acted of the people, by the people, and for the people, was in fact redistributing wealth from hardworking white people to black people and to immigrants, and especially in the North. And so they began in 1871 to call a government that leveled the playing field between the rich and the poor, between white people and black people, between native-born and immigrants, as socialism or communism. And I've talked elsewhere about how it gets those names. But they argue that anytime the government steps in to level the playing field, it is destroying American liberty. And they argue that the true nature of American individualism and liberty and strength is the individual, and the individual Westerner, especially the cowboy, who's become very popular in the 1870s and the 1880s through things like Buffalo Bill's Wild West Show. But also the counterpart to that Westerner is the Southern Confederate soldier, that lone guy on his pedestal. And they begin to erect statues to him, that nameless soldier, across the South, in the West, and also in places in the North. And what they say is that it's that individual who has preserved American liberty in the face of what they call socialism, and the attempt of black people and immigrants to destroy the country by using the government in ways that level the playing field between the wealthy and the poor, as I say, or black and white, or immigrant and native born. And so when those statues went up, they were embraced. They were embraced by white supremacists. They were embraced by people with money. They were embraced by anti-immigrant people in the country. In the North. This was really a symbol of what people thought it meant to be an American. So far from wanting to tear them down, Americans with money and Americans for whom the system was working put them up. And they had managed to cut out of political voice, either through voter suppression or by lynching those who would stand against them. So what's interesting about this moment with these statues coming down is that those people who previously were silenced have a voice now. And as they have a voice, and by the way, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. also took a stand against the Confederate statues. As they are doing so, and as they are tearing down those statues, they are signaling, I think, a regime change, and they are also signaling that we are now strong enough to say, hey, this is not right. The American government is not supposed to simply support the liberty of an individual to do whatever he wants in order to garner as much money as he can. The point of a government is, in fact, what Lincoln said it was, to do for American individuals what they cannot do for themselves, and to create a government of the people, by the people, for the people. So I think I'm going to leave it there today. Sorry, that was a little bit more loosey-goosey than usual, but I'm going to switch over now to hear the hearings from today, which I understand were lit. We'll see if we can figure out how to get this Facebook page back to some kind of usable form. And with luck, I will see you on Thursday when I'll pick up Reconstruction again. And until then, Thank you for being here, and I will be writing you a letter tonight. Thanks for being here.
Oh, and I think we're live. Hi, we're live. I didn't realize we were live. We were talking.
I wondered about that. When I came on, you were already live. You had one viewer.
Hi, friends. I thought we were live yet. I'm 51 and technology is still, things where I have to ask my kids for help. So now everybody knows that my house is a mess, literally, because I can't get to some of the stuff in my house. But I'm doing it from desktop now on Substack. So this is all sort of glitchy. You can do that now.
Oh, that's great.
Yes. So I did it last night and it was okay, but I did it now. And I apologize to everybody and my incredible guest, Heather Cox Richardson, because I didn't get to introduce you properly because I was complaining about my house being a mess.
But you know what? Doesn't that just symbolize where we all are? Like, people know who we are. Let's just chat.
Yeah, God, that feels so fucking good to hear because it's true. And honest to God, I think I want to talk to you about a million super incredibly important things because they are so important and no one talks about these things the way you do. But it's also, let's be real. I'm not going to say what I was going to say to you without knowing all these people were here, which is I have my Christmas trees up. I have them decorated. That was a small feat in and of itself. But then I look around and I'm like, I just can't get to this other stuff right now. I can't get to the laundry, which seems to be consuming my house. I'm pretty sure laundry reproduces. Does it, do they mate? I'm not sure I ever had that many socks, but now, so it's just, let's be real. It's fucking hard. And you're overworked because you're a voice that we look to right now. People need your perspective. I just had Tom Malinowski on my podcast right before this, and he has a question for you I want to get to at the end because he wants your perspective on things. So thank you for joining me, and thank you for everybody for putting up with me just ranting right there.
So just a question though, aren't your kids still at home?
Well, yeah, they're 12 and 16, and it's more frenetic than it ever was when they were toddlers.
So just for the record on laundry, think about it. Every day when your family changes its clothes, that's a load of laundry. Yeah. That really does. When they're little, it takes a lot of toddler socks to fill a washing machine. And then when they leave home, you're back down to yourself and your partner, and it's manageable again. But in those years, my great parenting invention, I can't believe I'm saying this publicly, was called the laundry game.
Okay.
And the laundry game was I would do all of the laundry on Saturday. The kids were little. Mm-hmm. And then we would play a game where I'd pile it all up on a couch, and I would throw pieces of it to each child and see how fast they could run it to get to their rooms to push it into a drawer. I mean, there was no folding, there was nothing. And they competed to win the laundry game. And I'm like, this is my contribution to parenting.
Kind of genius. Who needs Marie Kondo? Seriously, that's kind of genius because it's a game, and that's the whole thing. Meanwhile, it still stresses me out because I should. I don't know if it's going to work at 12 and 16, but I would love to try. They probably roll their eyes and be like, "Are you fucking kidding me?"
Oh, no. You can only do it when they're under 6. But boy, when I had a 2-year-old, a 5-year-old, and I guess an 8-year-old, man, it was a good game.
Like painting the fence, like in Tom Sawyer. Yeah, now, but and I don't know what it is with 16-year-olds with cups. Okay, so they take a drink of water and the cup goes next to the sink, and then they come back with another cup, and then all of a sudden there's 6 cups next to the sink. I don't understand why they don't. I promise you guys we're going to get into the important shit, but this is nobody talks about this. Why do they have to get a cup for every sip of water? What is that all about?
Well, just so you know, that doesn't go away.
Right.
And in fairness, I'm sitting here at this poor man's house, and I've got Pepsi cans everywhere and seltzer water and cups and,
Yeah, full disclosure, I have 2 cups of water. And
there you go. It's genetic. And you ask why do they do it and where they get it? Come on.
Yeah. You know what? Come to think of it, yeah, fruit doesn't fall far from the tree. But let's jump in because your time is precious, and I do want to ask you about. I'm going to start with Indiana because what we saw last night in Indiana. You opened your show, you're live with it last night. Let's talk about what happened, the impacts of what happened, and what that signals for where the Republican Party is. And I think of Donald Trump now kind of like the Bumble after Hermie pulls its teeth out. You know what I mean? It's like it's big and scary, but it doesn't have any teeth. So I would love to get your perspective on what we saw happen in Indiana last night when it came to the gerrymandering.
Okay, I'm happy to do that. I do want to point out that, well, it's fair, I think, to say that the Trump administration and that Donald Trump might not have teeth with regard to the Republican Party. They still run the United States government, and that still has a lot of teeth, and there are people literally dying because of that. And so we're in this weird thing where you've got the administration controlling the levers of power in the United States, and this is not only Trump, of course, but his people like Stephen Miller, the White House Deputy Chief of Staff, Russell Vought at the Office of Management and Budget, many of those different people. But in terms of what happened in Indiana and the idea that perhaps Trump is losing his Republican teeth, is that it looks pretty clearly as if the Republican Party is in real trouble in 2026 and 2028. And that itself is a really fascinating thing. And just for people who don't know, I did write the history of the Republican Party, so I know the party really well. The Democrats, I was actually working on a book about the Democratic Party when I started Letters from an American. So I know that pretty well, but there's very little of that in print. But it looks as if they're very concerned about losing that election. And that means a couple of things. First of all, it might very well mean that certain members of the administration get impeached. It certainly will mean, even if they simply lose the House of Representatives, some pretty deep investigations. It just isn't going to go well before 2028. And of course, if the Republicans lose the 2028 election and a Democrat becomes president, it looks as if there might be serious legal repercussions for a number of people in this administration. So this is not simply, we want to still be in power. This is, we might be in real trouble if we are not in power. So what that's meant when it looks as if Trump can't put his voters into the voting booths the way that he managed to do in 2024, which was always tenuous because he promised everything to everybody. And I kept saying, you can't be wet and dry at the same time, which is what he has promised people. So what they've tried to do is to change the district maps by gerrymandering them going into the 2026 election, primarily the Republican-dominated states that already had gerrymandered maps. It's worth remembering that Indiana's map is already gerrymandered. Out of 9 seats that go into Congress from Indiana, 7 of them already get won by Republicans and 2 by Democrats. This was an attempt to force the Indiana state legislature to put through a gerrymandered map that was so severe that, in fact, the Democrats couldn't win a seat, or it appeared that they couldn't win a seat. And the House in Indiana agreed to that. But the Senate did not. And a majority of the Republican senators, not just a few people, a majority of the Republican senators sided with the Democrats to say, this ain't happening. And, I don't have any connections to the Indiana State Senate. I don't know why they acted that way, but you can see them saying, at least in part, our voters don't want this. The voters in Indiana were very clear that they didn't want this. And I would emphasize that Indiana has its own quite independent frontier history. And I think that to some degree they're drawing on that. But then they also, I think, didn't want to be told what to do by a president whose approval ratings are in the mid-30s. Yeah. So what's interesting about that as a whole is that if you remember, Indiana was a state that gave Trump an early leg up in 2016. And said, this is not what we are looking for in a president. And so, again, most of us don't pay a ton of attention necessarily to state legislatures and what they're doing if you're not in that state. But this was a really big deal. And you can see that it was a big deal in part by how many people tried to get involved to force Indiana to do this, and about how they reacted when Indiana didn't do it, which is Trump backing off and saying, well, I really didn't care. Of course he cared. He had J.D. Vance and his son out there twisting arms. He threatened to remove all federal funding from Indiana, which was totally illegal. I mean, all of that stuff was there. Now he's saying, well, I didn't really care that much. This is, I think, a harbinger of the American people maybe finally having had enough of MAGA and being willing to turn somewhere else. And I'm not sure that's to the Democrats. I think it might be to a new political coalition.
That is very interesting because I haven't had an opportunity to speak with you since the elections we had here in New Jersey and Virginia and elsewhere. And this is an interesting progression from that point because it picks up, what you're saying about the American people, because we saw districts here in New Jersey who voted for Trump overwhelmingly. There's a town, Phillipsburg, which is in my district, which went for Mikey Sherrill, I think by 10 points when that went for Trump in 24 very easily. And so it fits again with what's happening in Indiana and elsewhere. The American people are saying, we've had enough of this. I also don't know where Marjorie Taylor Greene it will be going, whether that's aligning with the likes of Nick Fuentes and Tucker Carlson. But I want to talk about the elections that we had just really a month ago or so in New Jersey, Virginia, elsewhere. Also, the special election that they just had in Tennessee. And what those numbers and that turnout and that pendulum swing back, what that tells you to pick up on your point about Indiana.
Well, and the mayoral election in Miami, putting a Democrat in the mayoral seat for the first time in 30 years. That's a really big deal. Miami's a fascinating city. Someday I'm going to actually get to just do local, and state histories because they're really, the whole Indiana thing yesterday got me back reading, literature from that Ohio Valley culture, which, most people didn't even realize they had their own 19th century literature. And anyway, so listen, I don't predict the future, but I will tell you that we have come through a period that looks, again, to me, very much like the 1840s and the 1850s, or again, like the 1920s. And that's one in which a number of people recognized that the government, the way it was currently operating, was not serving their interests, primarily their economic interests. And we know that from new studies coming out of MIT and Harvard that cable news, especially the Fox News channel, ignored economic issues in order to force cultural issues down their viewers' throats because there was an economic model behind that, a business model behind that, that if you focused on issues like race or guns or transgender athletes or whatever, you got viewers who otherwise would not watch a news program. So rather than trying to poach news viewers from other channels, it was more beneficial to try and create new viewers. And what we got then was sort of a feedback loop where lawmakers continually pushed cultural issues that benefited the Republican Party in a way that we had really seen since at least Reagan and probably before that, all the way back to the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision. But what happened with that, if you think about it, and you think about 2016, I always like to remind people that Trump was the most economic progressive candidate in the 2016 election on the Republican side. People forget that because he forgot it. It never went forward. But if you listen to him in 2016, it was possible to hear him and think, this is it. This is my guy. He is going to make sure that money doesn't continue to flow upward, the more than $50 trillion that moved upward from the bottom 90% of Americans to the top 1%. And he's going to make things fairer. And the reality, of course, is we have seen just the opposite with him. And if you think about in the 1840s is what I've been really looking at now, but you could say the 1920s as well, you got a similar time when you got the rise of a new political party. In the 1840s, it was the Know Nothing Party. It was officially known as the American Party, but it became called the Know Nothings because if anybody asked about it, you were supposed to say, I know nothing, sort of pre-Sergeant Schultz. But they were organized around anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic sentiment. They were virulent, especially in Massachusetts and in New York. And it's actually, we get a long legacy of laws coming out of that have stretched well into the 20th century. But that's what they focused around. But the Know Nothing Party collapses immediately after the rise of the Republican Party. And the Republican Party, curiously enough, is pro-immigrant. If you read its first platforms in 1856 and 1860, they literally put in the platform, we want more immigrants. And yet, they got a ton of Know Nothing voters. So what made that shift? Scholars who have looked at this say that, in fact, what the voters that joined the Republican Party from the know-nothings, and what was really the thrust of the Republican Party in the 1850s, was its focus on guaranteeing that a small group of elite Southern enslavers did not take over the country's economic system and the country's government. So if you were a know-nothing, what you were really up to when you were mad about the situation as it was with the Whigs and the Democrats and joined this anti-immigrant party was that you didn't like the people in control at the time because they were not serving your interests. So when you got the rise of a new political party that said, we're going to make sure the rich guys don't get everything, the know-nothing switched over quite naturally, including some from leadership. There was a guy named Wilson in Massachusetts who becomes the author of a book called The Rise and Fall of the Slave Power. And that idea that we have gone through a period or are going through a period in which a number of voters were disaffected with the two majority parties, which makes sense if you look at the way people are now affiliated. We got a ton of independent voters that were coming through that, and people are saying, I joined MAGA not. And mind you, I'm not suggesting that racism and sexism is not central to those. That continues. But I joined that political party because I thought it was finally going to make sure that I had health care and that I got a decent wage and that I had housing. And what I have found is that I'm getting screwed even worse than I was before. And so I am open to something else. And that something else, I think, is what we are in the process now of creating.
I mean, that's just so incredible that you have all of that in your brain. But seeing them sending Donald Trump out to this end in Pennsylvania the other day to be the messenger for affordability, which he is telling his own voters is a hoax and a con job. When, again, this really sort of lines up with what you're saying too, because now he's trying to gaslight people who are looking around saying, no, everything's more expensive. This is much harder than you said it was going to be. I mean, we talked about the price of eggs, and now he's standing up on stage telling your kids to go with fewer dolls and fewer pencils like they have in China. I mean, it's like he's clearly not the messenger for that, but he has abandoned, if he ever had a core principle, that at least that arm of it, and to stand there in front of his own supporters and tell them, the affordability is something that the Democrats have made up. I mean, watching that in real time, I'm like, he's basically insulting them to their faces. And you could feel the room, the energy, something was clearly not landing. And I think that this is part of what you're talking about, where they're like, wait, hold on. This is not what we talked about. And you're looking at me and you're still telling me, you're pissing down my back and telling me it's raining in front of my face. That was my assessment of that.
Well, and I would go beyond that and say, well, that's definitely the case. It was weird. That, and then what he posted later on in the day, the thing about pencils, I just thought that was weird. When was the last time in your life, I mean, actually it's happened in my life because I'm a writer, but when was the last time pencils were front and center in your version of the world? I just thought that was so weird because, when I think of pencils, I think of Thoreau. Thoreau became who he was because his family made pencils. That's how he started out. But how often do pencils come up? I just thought that was the weirdest thing. And then the 37, 37, 37, that is the other problem I think that the Republicans have, is that Trump's mental acuity is clearly slipping. And, people say, well, is he going to run again for another 4 years in 2028, which of course he is saying he is going to, in order to turn people out to vote in 2026 and 2028. But remember, when we see him, that's him at his best.
Yeah. Yeah. And in that crazy thing you were referencing, that post, he talked about how he goes to Walter Reed often, and he actually said he's taken 3 cognitive tests, which I'm pretty sure are dementia tests. Isn't it the Montreal something assessment that he's talking about, where you have to identify a rhinoceros or an elephant or something like that? He's talking about acing those. But to say out loud that you took the test 3 times in front of many, many doctors, it's not the flex I think he thinks it is.
Well, so what's interesting about that too, though, is I don't think he wrote that. He definitely posted it. Well, look at it. So if you look at the run-on sentences, the difference in capitalization, the word aura, those are all things that are not usually in his vocabulary. So I don't know who wrote it, and I certainly, maybe he did. Maybe this is what he does in his free time. But I read it and I thought, this is very odd in a number of ways, because it just didn't look to me as if he had written it. So what was the message behind it? Why would somebody write that and say, spend half of it? It's almost a full half of it that is dedicated to his mental acuity.
Yeah.
I don't know. I thought the whole thing was, you know what? Everything is bizarre these days. Just everything is bizarre. And then you got somebody like me sitting here going, I'm not sure he wrote that. And, maybe he did, because you don't have any idea what to trust anymore, because everything is so slippery and coming at us so fast. It's very, very difficult to make a good portrait of it in real time, because you just got to see how it shakes out.
Yeah, and it often feels like it's coming from every single front. And I back to the top of this conversation where it feels overwhelming, and I think a lot of that is by design. I think it's just also by virtue of the fact that they have a lot of dismantling shit that they need to get done. But his health and his mental acuity, it did the hypocrisy of this being the thing that they said was the greatest scandal of the Biden presidency and the Biden administration, biggest cover-up. And we're literally looking at a cover-up on top of a cover-up as it pertains to his hand, which we're now being told is because of him handshaking to me. So what is he shaking hands with? A gibbon? Like, what is he shaking hands with? Like Edward Scissorhands? Like, but it's very interesting to hear you say that you're not sure he wrote that. And then it makes my mind wonder what that seed is that somebody might, and again, we're just guessing here, right? Because we don't know, but why someone might plant that seed, that there is something that he might be signaling, that they might be signaling is coming down the pipeline as it pertains to him and his fitness. And sort of that opens the door to this last part of the conversation I kind of want to pivot to, because maybe that's a move towards putting J.D. Vance into that position, and Donald Trump has exceeded his usefulness at this point, and they don't need him anymore. But J.D. Vance, on the other hand, he's been out there very publicly, like you said, in Indiana, but also pushing this nativism, this blood and soil, which is ironic given that he's married to an Indian woman and his children are half. But I was talking, like I said, to Tom Malinowski before this conversation. We were talking about the national security strategy document that came out, and how really one of the things, to boil it down in very basic, Cliff Notes terms, one of the things in it is that we're telling our European allies, unless you stop allowing immigrants into your countries, we don't want to play with you anymore. And so now we're seeing this policy of blood and soil here, this nativism here, jumping the ocean and impacting our approaches to national security abroad. And Trump's also been talking about, Europe might not exist. He said that out loud recently. So historically speaking, while they're calling Antifa a domestic terrorist threat, the number one domestic terrorist threat in this country, and kind of cozying up to far right and fascist groups in Europe, I'm just like, from your perspective, that document, if you've been doing any digging in it, if you've read it, if you're familiar enough with it, I had to pick Tom's brain about it, because I feel like it's also not getting enough attention, because it is a pretty seismic shift in terms of who the United States is telling the world we are. And like you said about immigrants in the beginning, when we were talking about sort of the 1840s and the Republican Party being pro-immigrant, to see where we are now, and that document in particular, this national security strategy, I would love to get your perspective on that too.
So yes, I read it. Actually, the minute it came out, I saw it come over my social media feed, and I'm a sucker for government documents. And I'd been waiting for that. So I read it, and it was quite late that it came out. It was on a Thursday night. And then I wrote about it the next day at some length, because it is, in fact, a white nationalist document that echoes Nazism and says everything that you just said. But what's interesting about it, there are a number of things that are interesting about it. The thing that jumped out to me at the time was the fact that it embraces the idea of spheres of influence, which are what we had before we had the post-World War II idea of a rules-based international order, which essentially creates a web around the world of trade and different institutions, both financial institutions and political institutions like the UN, like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization or NATO. It created this web to make sure that if any large country or strong country decided to invade its neighbors, that there was a gang essentially ready to kick them back out, which is what NATO is. It's a defensive alliance. This walks away from that concept and instead decides that, or argues that, the United States really needs to control South America. And it doesn't really mention Canada and Greenland, but it's pretty clear that Trump wants the United States to have control of the Western Hemisphere, and that opens up Russia to take over Europe, and it opens up Xi Jinping to take over the area around China, and Narendra Modi to take over India's sphere. There are many, many, many problems with that. The first of which being that opens up the ability for these great powers to have major conflicts, which led to things like World War I and World War II. But I think Trump likes it, first of all, because Putin likes it, but also because essentially it treats Latin America as a colony of the U.S. We're going to come extract all of their resources, and somebody's going to get rich. And I promise you, it ain't you and me or the rest of everyday Americans. But that being said, first of all, there's been pushback against that from the Congress, the United States Congress, and certainly from different diplomats. But the place I want to go with that is somewhat different, because a colleague of mine wrote to me after, I guess it was shortly after it came out, and said, why haven't you written about a book from 1916 called The Passing of the Great Race by Madison Grant? And the simple fact of the matter was, I was so focused on the geopolitical implications of the national security strategy that I wasn't really thinking as much as I should have been about the racial implications. And that book that I just mentioned is a book that argues that Western civilization is racially based. That, this is the whole Nordic people are the cat's pajamas and all that. I paraphrase, but you get the point. It also suggests eugenics to get rid of undesirable races. I mean, it's everything that you imagine when I say 1916. And it becomes so popular in the right-wing circles in Europe that Adolf Hitler actually writes to the author in the U.S. and calls this book his Bible, right? Yeah. Okay. But the kicker to this book in the United States is that it's really never very popular. It sells about 17,000 copies, which is a lot. It's not 12, but it falls out of favor very shortly after its publication. So by the 1930s, Americans really aren't behind this. So if you think about the periods written 1916, and the guy's not a historian, he invents all this stuff. And then you think about that period is the one where you're starting to see the rise of the second KKK, the second Ku Klux Klan, which is focused on purifying the country, not just of Black Americans, but also of immigrants. You get the rise of anti-immigrant sentiment. You get this whole flood. And yet, by the 1930s, this book has fallen into complete disrepute. And then you think again about the political implications of that. And you look at the fact that in the 1920s, were the Republican decade, right? You've got the election of Warren G. Harding in 1920, simply because he can fog a mirror, and I'm not exaggerating by much. You got the continuing election of people like Calvin Coolidge, and then by 1928, you've got Herbert Hoover winning in a landslide in 28. It looks like this is the direction the country is going to go. The economy crashes, and the Republican Party slams into a brick wall. And in 1932, you get the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a Democrat, and a complete reworking of American society under the New Deal. So that document is horrific. The NSS document is horrific. So is the Passing of the Great Race from 1916. That's horrific as well. But what really jumps out to me in both of those cases, and you saw this with former ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, talking about this on social media, this is not a popular position. And when you think about J.D. Vance taking over for Trump, which is where what your lead into this was, J.D. Vance is 100% embracing this. He's the one who defended those young Republicans for their Nazi talk, said, they were just kids, even though some of them were in their 30s and probably still leaving glasses of water around their mom's house. And he is definitely going down that road, trying to pick up the sort of Groyper side of the young Republicans. But the American people are just not behind this, I don't think, as a majority group. And the kicker going forward is going to be making sure we're very, very, very clear about this. And even those people who might embrace racism and sexism themselves need to be aware that once you have put in position a government that can go after people based on their race or their gender or their ethnicity or their language or their jobs, you fill in, or their religion, it is only a question of time until they come for you.
At first they came for. And Tom Mount again, the last thing I said before I get to his question, he cited a poll, I don't know from where, and I apologize, I'll find it, but where he did this question about what Americans support in terms of immigration and refugees coming into our country. 67% of those polled said they're in favor of continuing allowing refugees to come into our country. Only 3% of the people polled said they wanted exclusively for white South Africans. So you're right. I mean, this is deeply unpopular. Tom made a joke. He was like, you know how hard it is to get 3%? He's like, you ask your neighbors, you know, if the earth was flat, you'd get like 4 or 5 or 6%. But to get 3% is deeply unpopular. And it's true. And I think in many ways, that's another thing where I feel like they're trying to gaslight us. But I also think that it makes sense, again, to your point about, about this, the people waking up and saying this was always true, but they're saying enough of this is what it feels like to me. And it's not what we're seeing with these ICE raids and the disgusting, dragging of people. There was a mother who was going to see her baby in the NICU, who our friend Jessica Craven posted about, who was taken on her way to see her baby in the NICU. And I think all of that, the visuals of all of that, coupled with this being not who we are, and them telling us that this is who we are and not only where we're going, but where Europe is going, or will punish them. I am hopeful that this is going to help with that pendulum swing coming back as well. But I will end with Tom's question for you because it's a perfect place to end. He asked about hope. He asked about, as a historian, your objective perspective on where we are and what history tells us about where we are in this moment, in this, this sort of what feels like a vice grip, in between a slide into authoritarianism or the continuation of this experiment of American democracy. What gives you hope looking back anecdotally at what's happened throughout history?
Well, I can look back, but I can also, in this case, look forward. I have no doubt, none, that the United States of America and eventually most of the world will adopt a democratic system that serves the needs of the most people. And why do I think that? Because I believe that for human beings, the concept of self-determination, the idea that we get to figure out who we are and what we want to do with our extraordinarily brief time on Earth, will always win out. Americans, and I shouldn't speak for any other country because I'm an Americanist, Americans are not going to give that up. So when I think about where we are, I was thinking about this the other day, when you study Puritanism, which is the group of people who come to the United States in a great wave beginning in 1630, some of the great historians of Puritanism said, they were kind of an unbeatable combination because they believed that they were going to win no matter what, because they believed God was on their side. And I guess I believe I'm going to win because I believe humanity is on the side of human self-determination. So if that's my philosophy when I think about American democracy, which, by the way, has never been perfect, but that's part of the story of American democracy. When you talk about immigrants coming to this country and people embracing that idea of immigration, that's because the real story of America is not having something. The real story of America is striving for something. And immigrants, Black Americans, women, we're the people who define America because we are the ones who are constantly creating who we are and trying to create a nation that enables us to be who we want to be. But when I think about this particular moment in the light of history, I think it's pretty clear that we are looking at a small group of reactionaries, primarily made up of white older men, who are determined to make sure that they continue to stay in power and are doing everything they can to leverage the different pieces of this administration to keep themselves in power. And they are not going to give that up easily. So while the momentum is certainly on the side of those of us who are trying to protect democracy, the next several months at least are going to get worse and worse rather than getting better and better. And one of the things that I urge people to do is to remember, at least the way I think about it, that we are going to win. Maybe not tomorrow, and maybe not next week, and maybe not next year, and maybe not in my lifetime, and maybe not in my children's lifetime. But this is a winning ideology. It is essentially the definition of what it means to be a human being. And so long as we have humans, we will have people striving to be able to create themselves and a world for themselves to live in. So the quicker that will happen, we will win the most quickly if we all work incredibly hard at it now. And that's what I would urge people to do, is to remember that we are fighting not for a political party. I don't really care about political parties. We're fighting for a nation, and we're fighting for humanity. And those things are worth showing up for quickly, doing a lot for, and that will win in the end.
Well, I'm a crier, and I'm full disclosure, like trying not to ugly cry her now, because that gave me so much hope. But also, my dad came here as a teenager from Lebanon and seeking, a better life. And he worked for 50 years for the Department of Defense because he believed in the experiment and the promise of America, and he instilled that belief in me. And so hearing you say those words out loud, I'm sorry, but ugly cry. There it is.
Well, but that's the other piece of what we're doing is, thanks to new technologies and thanks to the fact that we can organize around these fundamental principles, we're making a community. You and I didn't know each other 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is just, that's the good side of all of this is, we have this, one of the things that I love about what I do is that the framers of the Declaration of Independence were always talking about the fact they had this extraordinary opportunity that almost nobody in human history got, which was to start everything over again. Thomas Paine says we have it in ourselves to start the world over again. And this is our time. We get to start the world over again, and we get to do it as a community, which is totally cool. For all the hard work, I wouldn't be anywhere else.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you for quoting Thomas Paine. I saw Jimmy Raskin speak recently. He quoted him as well. So Thomas Paine is not going quietly into that good night. And neither are you, Heather Cox Richardson. And the 5,000 people who are here, you are this community too. And I am so grateful that I had this time with you. I did not expect to ugly cry. Full confession, I ugly cry a lot. But you filled my cup in ways that I can't thank you for enough. And thank you to everybody else for being here. Heather, have a wonderful, happy, safe holiday season, and stay warm up there. And thank you so much. And cheers to you with my mini cups. Thank you. I'm going to try the laundry game with my 12 and 16-year-old until they tell me to fuck up. All right. Well, thanks, Heather.
Have a great holiday. I'll see you in the new year.
All right, I'll see you later. Thanks, everybody. Bye.